Achab. The figure of Achab is one of the most complex and emblematic in the biblical narrative of the Old Testament. King of Israel, he reigned during a turbulent period marked by political, religious, and spiritual battles. Achab was not just a ruler, he was a character whose life and decisions left deep marks on the fate of his people. Origins and rise to the throne. Achab was the seventh king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and the son of Omri, one of the most powerful rulers of the time. Omri established the capital in Samaria, founding a dynasty that would influence the course of Israel for many decades. Achab ascended to the throne at a delicate moment, inheriting a kingdom divided by internal conflicts and external threats. His father's reign had been marked by constant wars and attempts to maintain stability. But Achab would face even greater challenges. According to the Bible, he reigned for 22 years. His ascent is detailed in the book of 1 Kings, which notes that his reign was characterized by political alliances, wars, and, unfortunately, a deep involvement with pagan practices, marriage to Jezebel, and foreign influence. One of the decisive moments in Achab's life was his marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, daughter of King Ethbaal of Tyre. This marriage was much more than a personal union. It was a political alliance that brought profound spiritual and cultural consequences for Israel. Jezebel was a worshipper of Baal, one of the main pagan gods of the Middle East. With her arrival, she introduced a strong influence of Phoenician religion in Israel, which included idolatrous cults, human sacrifices, and practices abominable to the God of Israel. Jezebel did not limit herself to privately worshipping her gods. She influenced Achab in the court, encouraging the construction of altars and temples to Baal, and persecuting the prophets of the Lord. This influence deeply marked Achab's reign, leading Israel into a period of spiritual decline, politics, and wars. During Achab's reign, beyond the religious dimension, Achab was also a king involved in a series of military and diplomatic conflicts. He sought to expand Israel's territory and protect its borders against enemies like the Arameans. A notable episode was the war against Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. Achab initially faced difficulties but managed to establish temporary peace agreements, demonstrating diplomatic and military skill. On the other hand, his relationship with King Jehoshaphat of Judah is remarkable. The two kings formed a political and military alliance, conducting joint campaigns against common enemies. However, this partnership was not always successful, mainly due to strategic failures and disobedience to divine guidance. The conflict with Elijah, the prophet of the Lord. The most emblematic figure intersecting with Achab's life is the prophet Elijah. Elijah was a man of God who directly confronted the king in his court, challenging the established idolatry and calling the people to repentance. Elijah is portrayed as a courageous and determined prophet who publicly denounced Achab's unfaithfulness to the Lord. One of the most famous episodes is the confrontation on Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to prove who the true God was. Achab, influenced by Jezebel, initially tried to suppress Elijah and the followers of the true God. Jezebel even sent messengers to threaten the prophet's life, forcing him to flee into the desert. The challenge on Mount Carmel was one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power in the Old Testament, where Elijah prayed, and God responded with fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, and showing the Lord's superiority over Baal. The fall of Achab, greed, and divine justice. Achab's story is marked not only by his involvement with idolatry, but also by his personal conduct, which led him to a tragic end. The episode symbolizing Achab's fall involves Naboth's vineyard. Naboth was a righteous man who owned a vineyard next to the king's palace. Achab desired this vineyard to turn it into a garden, but Naboth refused to sell it, as it was a family inheritance. Dissatisfied, Achab became sad and allowed himself to be influenced by Jezebel, who devised a plan to eliminate Naboth. Jezebel sent false witnesses to accuse Naboth of blasphemy and treason, leading to his death by sword. After Naboth's death, Achab took possession of the vineyard. However, the prophet Elijah confronted the king, declaring that because of this unjust act and his idolatry, the kingdom would suffer severe consequences. Death and legacy of Achab. Achab died in battle during a war against the Arameans. The Bible reports that he wore special clothes for battle, tried to flee, and was killed by an arrow, thus fulfilling Elijah's prophecy about his fate. His body was thrown into a field, and wild animals consumed it, in a death considered disgraceful. Achab's legacy is complex. He is remembered as one of the most wicked kings of Israel, whose alliance with Jezebel and idolatrous policies led the kingdom to spiritual and political decline. However, his story also reveals important aspects of the struggle between good and evil, divine justice, and mercy. Analysis of Achabe's character. King Achabe was an ambitious and pragmatic man who sought to consolidate his power through political alliances and religious control. His weakness, however, lay in his submission to Jezebel's negative influence, which led him away from the paths of the Lord. He is an example of how power, when unaccompanied by faithfulness to God, can corrupt the leader and lead a people to ruin. Despite this, the confrontation with Elijah reveals that God did not abandon Israel, and that there is always room for repentance and restoration. Although Achabe failed in this aspect, the relevance of Achabe for today. Achabe's life serves as a warning for leaders and for anyone. The importance of maintaining moral and spiritual integrity in the face of power, pressures, and external influences. Moreover, the episode of Naboth's vineyard teaches us about social justice, respect for others' property, and the fight against corruption, topics that are still very relevant today. The historical and cultural context of Achabe's reign. To better understand Achabe's life and actions, it is essential to situate him in the historical and cultural context of the ancient Near East. During his reign, neighboring kingdoms, such as Syria and Judah, vied for power and influence in the region. The constant pressure from these enemies forced kings to seek strategic alliances, like Achabe's marriage to Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Tyre. This alliance with the Phoenician kingdom brought not only political advantages, but also a cultural and religious mix that shook the Israelite identity. The Israeli society of the time was divided between those who remained faithful to the God of their ancestors, and those who were seduced by foreign cults and pagan practices. Achabe, unfortunately, was a leader who facilitated the spread of this idolatry. Achabe's relationship with other biblical characters, in addition to Jezebel and Elijah, Achabe interacted with several other important figures, such as the prophet Micaiah. The latter was called to predict the outcome of a battle and challenge the king, predicting his imminent defeat and death. Achabe also interacted with his subjects and commanders, although his dependence on Jezebel and his own vanity often overshadowed the wisdom of faithful counselors. These relationships show a king surrounded by internal and external conflicts, whose lack of spiritual firmness contributed to his downfall. Spiritual and moral lessons from Achabe's life. Achabe's trajectory presents us with several profound lessons. First, it highlights the importance of faithfulness to God, regardless of political and cultural pressures. Achabe chose the path of idolatry and injustice, which cost him dearly. Additionally, his story warns of the dangers of negative influence, especially when a leader allows another person to control their decisions, as happened with Jezebel. Finally, the episode of Naboth's vineyard reminds us that social justice and respect for others must be priorities, as no achievement is worthwhile when built on injustice and oppression. Final reflections on Achabe. Achabe represents, in the Bible, a character whose life is a mix of power, corruption, moral failures, and tragic consequences. His story is a portrait of the struggle between faithfulness to God and the temptations of the world. He invites us to reflect on what it means to govern justly, maintain integrity, and resist influences that can lead us away from spiritual values. Although he was a powerful king, his life serves as a warning for us to seek wisdom, courage, and faithfulness in our own journeys. If you resonated with this inspiring story, don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to know about Achabe. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. See you in the next video with more inspiring stories like this one.